The air at Thompson's John Deere dealership in the spring of '71 tasted of fresh green paint, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, cloying sweetness of a salesman's aftershave. It was a smell Earl Jensen didn't much care for. He stood out back in the gravel lot, a place reserved for trade-ins and scrap, where the manicured green and yellow pride of the showroom gave way to the reality of iron that had seen hard service. His eyes were fixed on a carcass of a tractor, painted a faded, sun-blistered red that was an affront to the very ground it sat on. It was a Farmall M, probably a 49 or a 50 from the look of it. One rear tire was flat, the rubber cracked like an old man's heel. The other was holding air, but just barely. Rust wept from the seams of the fuel tank and stained the engine block in long, orange streaks. The steering wheel was chipped down to the metal core in places, a testament to thousands of hours of calloused hands guiding it through black Iowa soil. To anyone else, it was junk, a parts tractor at best. To Earl, it was an opportunity. A low rumble grew behind him, the confident purr of a modern diesel engine. A brand-new John Deere 4320, its enclosed cab gleaming, rolled to a stop nearby. The door hissed open, and Roger Peterson swung himself down, his work boots barely dusty. Roger was everything Earl wasn't. His farm, inherited like Earl's, was 3 times the size and growing. His credit line at the bank was a local legend, and his loyalty to John Deere was absolute. Roger swaggered over, a smirk already playing on his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. You lost, Jensen? Or are you finally opening that museum you're always talking about?" He gestured with his thumb at the derelict Farmall. "That's a hell of a centerpiece for your collection." Earl didn't turn. He ran a hand over the cold steel of the Farmall's fender, feeling the pits and dings. He knew every bolt on the M he already had at home, the one his father had bought brand new in 1951. He could practically feel the ghost of this one's engine, the simple, rugged power of its 4-cylinder C248 gasoline engine. "Just lookin', Roger," Earl said, his voice quiet. "Looking at what? A tetanus shot waiting to happen?" Roger laughed, a loud, booming sound that carried across the lot. The door to the dealership's shop slid open, and Tom Thompson, Jr., the owner's son, stepped out, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He was followed by his father, a man whose smile was as wide as his profit margins. "What's the commotion?" Old Man Thompson asked, his eyes crinkling. Then he saw Earl and the old Farmall. "Oh, Earl, didn't see you there. Find something to your liking in our antique section." The younger Thompson chuckled. "Dad, he's probably trying to figure out if he can get it running on nostalgia. Heard that's what fuels his other one." The 3 of them stood there, a triangle of modern, financed success, looking at Earl and his pile of red rust. Roger, with his new tractor that cost more than Earl's entire farm was worth. The Thompsons, who made a living selling progress in 12-foot swaths. Earl felt the familiar heat rise in his neck, the quiet anger that he'd learned to swallow down like bitter coffee. He was a joke to them, a relic, just like the tractor he was admiring. He was the man who still farmed 240 acres with a tractor that had no cab, no power steering, and a horsepower rating that wouldn't even run the hydraulics on Roger's new planter. "What do you want for it?" Earl asked, his voice flat, directed at the elder Thompson. Thompson blinked, surprised. "For that?" "Hell, Earl, I was going to call the scrapper next week. Give me $200 and it's yours. Save me the phone call." "I'll give you $150. Cash," Earl said, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He knew the scrap price for a tractor that size was probably closer to $100. He was still overpaying, but he wanted it. Roger let out another bark of laughter. $150. I just paid more than that for the radio in my new pickup. You're really stepping up in the world, Earl." Earl ignored him. He counted out the bills, a 50, 4 20s, and 5 10s, all worn and soft from hard work. He placed them in Thompson's outstretched palm. The dealer looked at the cash as if it were a foreign object. He was used to signed loan agreements and checks with the bank's letterhead, not worn-out bills that smelled of sweat and soil. "Sold," Thompson said with a shrug, pocketing the money. "You got to have it off the lot by tomorrow, though. It's an eyesore." "It'll be gone by supper," Earl promised. He spent the next hour wrestling the crippled machine. He had to fetch his own truck and his lowboy trailer. He used a heavy-duty come-along, chaining it to the Farmall's drawbar and the front of the trailer. It was slow, grueling work. The chain groaned, the come-along's handle clicked and clacked, and the old tractor moved inches at a time. The flat tire dragged and scraped against the gravel, a sound of protest. Roger and the Thompsons had long since gone back inside to talk about interest rates and trade in values on next year's models. They left Earl alone in the back lot, a man out of time, wrestling with his past. By the time he had the tractor chained down on the trailer, the sun was low and his knuckles were bleeding. He drove home slow, the weight of the old iron making his Ford F-250 squat on its springs. He passed Roger's farm on the way. A massive new machine shed was going up, its steel beams stark against the evening sky. A brand new John Deere planter, a 12-row model, sat waiting for the season to begin. It was a picture of prosperity, of the future of farming. Earl pulled into his own lane, a simple gravel track that led to a modest white farmhouse and a collection of weathered red barns. His place was neat, the fences tight, the buildings in good repair. But it was small. It looked like a farm from a generation ago. He backed the trailer up next to the workshop, the same shop where his father had taught him how to set the timing on their first Farmall, how to read a spark plug, how to tell by the sound of an engine if it was running rich or lean. He shut off the truck and sat for a long moment in the silence, the smell of his own sweat filling the cab. He looked at the silhouette of the broken tractor on the trailer, then at the tidy, debt-free farm that was his. Everyone thought he was a fool, a stubborn, backward fool who was too scared to take a risk. They saw him clinging to the past while a river of money flowed all around him. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just afraid. Or maybe, just maybe, he understood something they didn't. Maybe he knew that the tide that comes in so fast can go out just as quickly. Before we go any further, before we get into the nuts and bolts of bringing this old iron back to life and the years of struggle that followed, I've got to ask you folks something. Have you ever had that feeling? That moment when everyone's laughing, when the whole world is telling you you're wrong, but you know, deep in your bones, that you're on the right path? Let me know down in the comments. I'm curious to hear your stories, because I read every single one. The first job was to get the dead M off the trailer and into the workshop. It was too heavy to push by himself, and his other Farmall, the 51 model he called Old Reliable, was out in the field with the disc attached, so he did it the old way. He chocked the trailer wheels, unhooked the truck, and used a pair of hydraulic jacks and a stack of oak blocks to lift the tractor's front end. He swapped the ruined tire for a spare he kept for his other M. It didn't match, but it held air. For the flat rear tire, he used a portable air tank to inflate it, just enough to get it rolling. It hissed and leaked, but it would hold for a few minutes. He hitched Old Reliable to the front of the new project with a heavy chain and slowly, carefully, towed it off the trailer and into the cavernous, dimly lit workshop. The smell inside was a comfort to Earl. 100 years of earth, oil, and honest work soaked into the wooden beams. He positioned the new tractor in the main bay under the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. For the rest of the evening, he just looked at it, circling it like a wolf studying its prey. He made a list in his head. The fuel system would be shot. The tank would have to be removed and cleaned, maybe even sealed. The carburetor would need a full rebuild. The ignition system, magneto, wires, plugs, was a complete unknown. The oil was probably sludge. The next morning, he started. He drained the fuel tank first, and what came out was a foul-smelling, rust-colored varnish that wasn't fit to burn. He unbolted the tank and spent the better part of the day with a length of chain and a bucket of diesel fuel, sloshing it around inside to break the rust loose. Then he rinsed it with gasoline until it was clean. He pulled the carburetor, a simple International Harvester model, and laid its pieces out on a clean rag on his workbench. Each jet, each gasket, each tiny spring, he cleaned with a wire brush and carb cleaner until the brass gleamed. He ordered a rebuild kit from the parts store in town, one of the few places that still stocked parts for tractors that old. While he waited for the kit, he turned to the engine. He pulled the spark plugs. They were fouled, black with carbon. A bad sign. He poured a little Marvel mystery oil into each cylinder to loosen the rings, just in case they were seized. He drained the oil pan, and the thick black goo that oozed out confirmed his suspicions. The tractor hadn't run in a long, long time. He cleaned the sediment bowl, a glass cup designed to catch water and dirt from the fuel, and replaced the screen. He filed the points on the magneto and set the gap with a feeler gauge, the same way his father had shown him 30 years before. Day after day, he worked. It was slow, methodical labor. He wrestled with bolts that hadn't been turned since the Truman administration, his muscles straining, his knuckles getting skinned raw. He learned the tractor's history from the scars it bore, a welded repair on the drawbar, a dent in the grill from a run-in with a fence post, the way the clutch pedal was worn smooth on one side. Meanwhile, the world of modern farming roared on around him. From his workshop, he could hear the deep-throated growl of Roger Peterson's 4320 working the fields across the road. Roger could disc a field in half the time it took Earl. When planting season came, Roger was a whirlwind of efficiency. His new 12-row planter, pulled by that powerful diesel tractor, laid down seed with a precision Earl could only dream of. Earl was out there on Old Reliable, pulling a 4-row planter, bouncing along on the steel pan seat, eating dust. The talk at the co-op was merciless. Earl would be standing in line to buy a bag of seed corn, and he'd hear the whispers. There's Jensen, still trying to farm like it's 1950. Heard he bought another piece of junk from Thompson's. Guess he's allergic to making money. It's a shame. His father was a good man, but he held on too tight. Looks like the son is the same way. One afternoon, Earl was trying to get the newly rebuilt carburetor back on the new M. The gasket wasn't seating right, and he was getting frustrated. Roger Peterson pulled into his lane, his new Chevy pickup kicking up a cloud of dust. He leaned out the window. "Having fun with your new toy?" Roger asked, a condescending grin on his face. "Getting there," Earl mumbled, not looking up. "You know, Earl," Roger said, his tone shifting to one of mock sincerity, "there's no shame in getting a loan. The bank is practically giving money away. You could trade both of those old relics in and get a down payment on a decent used 3020. Something with a little power. You're working yourself to death for nothing." "I'm doing all right," Earl said, finally getting the bolt to thread. "Are you?" Roger pressed. "I'll have all my corn in by tomorrow. You'll be lucky to be done by the end of the week. Time is money, Earl. You're losing money every hour you spend tinkering with that thing instead of being in the field." He shook his head, revved his engine, and pulled away. The words stung, because Earl knew they were partly true. He was losing time. A week later, his point was proven. He finally had the new M running. After days of work, he filled it with fresh gas and oil, hooked up a battery, and hit the starter. The engine turned over, coughed, and then roared to life with a plume of blue smoke. The sound of that simple, powerful engine, running steady for the first time in years, was one of the most satisfying things Earl had ever heard. He let it run for an hour, listening, tuning the carburetor by ear until it purred. He christened it the second chance. He put it to work right away, hooking it to his old four-bottom plough to turn over a stubborn patch of sod he was converting to cropland. But halfway through the field, a hydraulic line, brittle with age, burst. Hot fluid sprayed all over the engine block, and the plough dropped uselessly to the ground. It was a 2-hour fix, and another trip to town for a new hose. 2 hours where Roger Peterson was already cultivating the corn he had planted 2 weeks ago. It was a constant battle, a race he felt he was always losing. He wasn't just fighting rust and worn-out parts. He was fighting time itself. The years between 1972 and 1978 were what they later called the Golden Age. It started with the Great Grain Robbery, when the Russians bought millions of tons of American wheat, and suddenly commodity prices shot to the moon. Corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for years, jumped to $2, then $3. Soybeans followed suit. Land values, which had been stable for a generation, exploded. A farmer's net worth could double in a single year, on paper at least. The message from the government, from the banks, from the magazines, was clear and seductive. Expand. Get big or get out. And Roger Peterson was getting big. He bought the 80 acres to his east, then the 160 to his north. He traded the 43-220 for a brand new 46-630, a monster of a tractor with dual rear wheels and a cab so quiet you could listen to the radio while you worked. He bought a new 6-row corn head for his combine, then traded the whole combine for a new 7700 turbo. Every year it was something bigger, newer, greener. His farm was a showcase of modern agricultural power. He tore down the old farmhouse he grew up in and built a sprawling brick ranch-style house on a hill overlooking his empire. His wife drove a new station wagon, and his kids had new bikes every year. Roger became the poster boy for Blackwood County prosperity. The bankers would bring potential clients out to his farm to show them what was possible. Tom Thompson, Jr. put a picture of Roger and his new combine in a full-page ad in the local paper. To everyone, Roger was a visionary, a man of action who had seized the moment, and Earl Jensen was the man who had missed the boat. He kept farming his 240 acres. His 2 Farmall M's, now both painted a gleaming, fresh red with new decals, were his entire tractor fleet. He still used the 4-row planter. He still cultivated his corn, driving slowly between the rows to kill the weeds, while Roger just hired a crop duster to spray his fields with herbicides. Earl's yields were good as anyone's, but his volume was a fraction of Roger's. The high prices were good for Earl too, but he used the money differently. He didn't buy more land. He paid his property taxes, which were climbing every year. He bought his seed and fertilizer for the next season in the fall, paying cash to get a discount. He spent one winter residing the barn and putting a new steel roof on the corn crib. He bought a used grain dryer and erected a new 10,000-bushel grain bin, doing most of the work himself with a couple of older, retired neighbors. It allowed him to store his corn and sell it in the spring, when prices were often higher, instead of being forced to sell right out of the field at harvest time when the market was flooded. Every improvement was small, practical, and paid for with cash from his pocket. His farm was becoming more efficient, more self-sufficient, but it wasn't getting any bigger. And in the eyes of the community, that made him a failure. One fall afternoon in '78, Earl was waiting in line at the grain elevator. The line was long, full of massive grain trucks and wagons pulled by huge modern tractors. Earl was there with his simple gravity wagon, pulled by the Second Chance. Roger Peterson pulled up alongside him in his gleaming Peterbilt grain truck, the first farmer in the county to own his own semi. He rolled down the window. The pity in his eyes was worse than the old mockery had ever been. "Earl," he said, his voice low and earnest, "it's not too late. Land is $1,000 an acre, but it'll be $2,000 next year. The bank will still loan you the money. You're a good farmer, a hard worker, but you're sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig. You could have all this." He swept his hand out, indicating his truck, the bustling elevator, the whole booming farm economy. Earl just looked at him. Roger's face was flushed with success, but there were new lines of stress around his eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. Owning an empire was a heavy burden. "I'm doing all right, Roger," Earl said. The same thing he always said. "All right isn't good enough anymore." Roger's voice rose with frustration. "Don't you see what's happening? You're going to get left behind, man. You're going to wake up one day and it'll all be gone because you were too scared to borrow $1. The line moved and Roger's truck rumbled forward. Earl watched him go. He knew Roger meant well, in his own way. He was offering the only advice he knew. But Earl's father's voice was a constant echo in his mind. "Never bet the farm, son. Never bet what you can't afford to lose. The bank is your best friend when you're making money, but they're the first ones to the auction when you're not." That winter, the winter of 1979, was a cold one. The snow came early and stayed late. Earl spent most of his days in the workshop, performing his annual ritual of maintenance on the two Farmalls. He had the engine of Old Reliable partially torn down, replacing the piston rings and bearings, ensuring it would be ready for its 30th season of work. The radio was on, playing softly from a dusty shelf. The usual farm report was interrupted by a news bulletin. The announcer's voice was grave, talking about inflation, about the prime interest rate, about a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was determined to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. The announcer said the prime rate had just hit 15%. Earl stopped what he was doing, a greasy wrench hanging from his hand. 15%. He did the math in his head. He thought about Roger Peterson, with his hundreds of acres of mortgaged land, his massive operating loans for his new equipment, his new house. The interest payment alone on that kind of debt would be staggering. A cold wind rattled the workshop door, whistling through a crack in the frame. For the first time in years, Earl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The party was loud and the music was playing, but outside the door, a storm was gathering, and almost no one could hear it coming. The news about the 15% prime rate was a distant rumble of thunder on a hot summer day. You heard it, you knew it meant something, but it was still far enough away that you could keep on working. Through the spring and summer of 1980, the machinery of the farm boom kept grinding on, but now there was a high-pitched whine in the gears that hadn't been there before. The talk at the co-op changed. It was less about buying the next quarter section of land and more about locking in fertilizer prices, less about new combines, more about the cost of diesel fuel. For Earl, life continued its steady rhythm. He planted his corn with Old Reliable, the 51M purring like it was its first season, not its 30th. He cultivated with the Second Chance, the once derelict tractor, now a trusted partner. His operating costs were a pittance compared to his neighbours. He bought his fuel in bulk, paying cash. His biggest expense was seed corn, and even that he paid for up front. He had no notes at the bank, no variable interest rates eating him alive in the night. He was a man on a small, sturdy island, and the tide was beginning to rise around everyone else. The first real sign of the crisis, the first wave to crash over the seawall of optimism, wasn't economic. It was the sky. The spring rains of 1980 were sparse, and by June the sun was a merciless, brassy disk in a hazy, white sky. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high and deep green, was stunted and pale, the leaves rolling up tight like cigars by mid-afternoon, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. Day after day, the forecast was the same, hot and dry. The ground cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. The farm ponds shrank, their edges turning to a crust of dried mud. The drought hit everyone, but it hit the leveraged farmers the hardest. They had massive loan payments based on projections of 150 bushel corn. With the drought, they'd be lucky to get 80 bushels. Roger Peterson's empire, sprawling and magnificent, began to look thirsty. He had installed a massive center-pivot irrigation system on one of his new quarters, a marvel of modern engineering that drew water from a deep well. But it was expensive to run, the diesel engine powering the pump drinking fuel at a terrifying rate, and it only covered 1/6 of his total acreage. The rest of his corn was burning up, just like everyone else's. One sweltering afternoon in late July, Earl was in his workshop, sharpening the blades on his sickle bar mower. He heard a frantic roar from the road and looked up to see Roger's John Deere 46630 thundering into his lane, pulling a haybine. Roger slammed the tractor to a halt in a cloud of dust and jumped from the cab, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Earl, you got a hydraulic press?" he yelled, his voice tight with panic. "Sure," Earl said calmly, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's the trouble?" "Bearing went out on the main drive shaft of this damn haybine," Roger spat, kicking the machine's massive tire. "Thompson's is backed up for a week. A week! My alfalfa is burning up in the field. I gotta get this thing fixed now." Earl walked over and looked at the complex guts of the machine. He could see the problem. A heavy-duty sealed bearing had disintegrated. "That's a press-fit bearing, all right. We can get it out." For the next 2 hours, the two men worked in the stifling heat of the workshop. Roger, used to calling a mechanic, was clumsy and impatient, his frustration boiling over with every stubborn bolt. Earl was the opposite, quiet, methodical, his movements economical and sure. He knew just where to apply heat with the acetylene torch, just how much pressure to use on the press. He had a collection of old bearing races and steel slugs he used as drifts, tools he'd made himself over the years for just such a job. Finally, with a loud pop, the ruined bearing came free. Roger slumped against the workbench, breathing heavily. "Thanks, Earl. I really appreciate it." He looked around the workshop, at the neatly organized tools, the clean floor, the two old red tractors standing like sentinels. "You know how much Thompson wanted to charge me for a service call? $200 plus parts, and I'd have to wait a week." "Well," Earl said, holding up the new bearing Roger had brought. "This one's ready to go back in." As they worked the new bearing into place, Roger's guard seemed to drop. "The bank called again yesterday," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're concerned about my operating loan. With the drought and corn prices starting to slip, they're talking about reappraising the land." Earl didn't say anything. He just kept working, centering the shaft perfectly in the press. He knew what a reappraisal meant. The land values had been artificially inflated, propped up by cheap credit and high commodity prices. If the bank decided the land was worth less, his loan-to-value ratio would be shot. They could call the notes. "I'm doing everything they told me to do," Roger said, his voice thick with a mix of anger and bewilderment. "I expanded. I modernized. I bought the best equipment. I was supposed to be safe." Earl looked at him then, his gaze steady. "They weren't selling you safety, Roger. They were selling you debt. There's a difference." He gave the handle of the press one final, firm push. The bearing slid home with a satisfying thud. The job was done. The harvest of 1980 was a grim affair. The yields were abysmal, and the grain embargo Carter had slapped on the Soviets in response to the invasion of Afghanistan had cratered the market. Corn prices that had been over $3 were now struggling to stay above $2. Farmers were hauling in half a crop and getting paid 2/3 the price. The math was brutal. It was during this harvest that the final nail was driven into the coffin of Roger's operation. He was running his massive John Deere 72700 turbo combine, trying to suck every last kernel from the withered stalks, when it happened. A loud bang, a shudder that ran through the whole machine, and then a grinding, metallic scream. He shut it down immediately, his heart pounding. The diagnosis from the dealer mechanic was catastrophic. A final drive planetary gear set had failed. It was a complex, expensive repair deep in the bowels of the machine. The parts alone were over $5,000. The labor would be another $2, and the combine would be down for at least 10 days, waiting for parts to be shipped from Moline. 10 days, in the middle of harvest, with the weather threatening to turn. Earl saw it happen. He was across the road, chugging along on his old Alice Chalmers all-crop 66 pull-type combine, a tiny, simple machine he'd bought for a few $100s years ago. He towed it with the second chance. It was slow. It only took 2 rows at a time. But it was his. It was paid for. And when something broke, he could usually fix it with a wrench and a welder in a couple of hours. He watched as the big, green, silent combine was loaded onto a lowboy trailer and hauled away, a wounded giant being taken from the battlefield. He saw Roger standing at the edge of the field, his hands on his hips, looking out over hundreds of acres of corn that he now had no way to harvest. The cracks in the empire had given way, and the whole foundation was beginning to crumble. The winter of 1981 felt like a funeral. The news was a constant drumbeat of doom. The Federal Reserve, relentless in its war on inflation, had pushed the prime rate to a staggering 21%. Variable rate loans, the kind every farmer had, were resetting at impossibly high levels. A farmer who had borrowed $100,000 at 8% was now paying 20% or more. The interest payments alone were more than a farm could possibly gross in a year. The word foreclosure, once whispered in shame, was now a common topic of conversation at the diner. For Roger Peterson, the end came swiftly. The catastrophic combine repair had wiped out his remaining cash. The bank, seeing the disastrous harvest numbers and the collapsing land values, refused to extend his operating loan for the next season. They called his notes, all of them. The farm, the equipment, the new brick house on the hill, everything was leveraged, and the bank owned it all. The auction was set for a Saturday in early March of 1982. It was a cold, grey day, with a raw wind that whipped across the bare fields. It felt like the whole county was there, not out of spite, but as mourners at a wake. They stood in clusters, their hands in their pockets, their voices low, their faces grim. They were watching a neighbor's life be dismantled, piece by piece, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. The auctioneer's truck was parked in front of the massive machine shed that Roger had been so proud of. Lined up in neat rows on the frozen ground was the machinery that had once been the envy of Blackwood County: the 4630 tractor, the 12-row planter, the giant chisel plow, the grain trucks. The John Deere 7700 combine, its final drive repaired at the bank's expense to make it sellable, stood there gleaming, a monument to a dream that had died. Earl was there. He hadn't wanted to come, but his wife, Mary, had insisted. "You go," she'd said. "You go to bear witness. Roger may have been a fool, but he's still our neighbor." He stood at the back of the crowd, his old canvas coat pulled tight against the wind. He watched as Roger and his family stood near the farmhouse, their faces pale and drawn. They looked like ghosts haunting their own lives. The auctioneer started, his rhythmic chant rolling across the crowd, a sound that was usually exciting, but today felt like a death knell. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. The prices were heart-breakingly low. A 4-year-old tractor, bought for $50,000, sold for $20,000. The planter went for a third of its original price. It was a slaughter. Most of the buyers were from out of state, vulture investors or massive corporate farms, picking the bones of the family farm crisis clean. Local farmers just shook their heads and watched. Then the auctioneer moved to the smaller items, the tools from the workshop. A rolling toolbox, socket sets, wrenches. Earl saw a set of old blacksmithing tools on a table, a heavy anvil, tongs, hammers. He recognized them. They had belonged to Roger's grandfather, a man who had built the original farm with his bare hands. No one was bidding on them. They were relics, useless to the modern farmer. "Who'll give me $50 for the lot?" the auctioneer called. Silence. $20? $20, folks, for a piece of history. Earl raised his hand. "50, he said, his voice clear and steady. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. "I've got 50. Do I hear 60? The crowd was silent. "Sold, for $50 to Earl Jensen." He saw Roger look over at him, a flicker of confusion in his tired eyes. Earl just gave a short, respectful nod. The last thing to be sold was the land itself. It was broken into parcels. The outlots, the new ground Roger had bought during the boom, went first, selling for less than half of what he'd paid for them just a few years earlier. Finally, they came to the last parcel. The original 80 acres, the piece that held the house, the barns, the history of the Peterson family, the homestead. The bidding started. A man in a suit, representing an insurance company from Des Moines, was the primary bidder. It was clear he was going to get it. The idea of that historic farmstead, the place where Roger had grown up, being owned by a faceless corporation, sent a chill through Earl that had nothing to do with the wind. He thought of his own farm, paid for with the sweat of his father and grandfather. He thought of the 2 red tractors in his shed, symbols of his own survival. He had cash in the bank, not a lot by the standards of men like the one in the suit, but it was real money. It was his. When the bidding stalled, Earl stepped forward. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had never done anything like this in his life. He raised his hand. He bid. The man in the suit looked over, annoyed. He raised the bid. Earl raised it again. They went back and forth, the price climbing higher than it should have, higher than the land was technically worth in that depressed market. The crowd went dead silent, watching the quiet man who farmed with antiques go toe-to-toe with the man from the city. Finally, the man in the suit shook his head and waved his hand at the auctioneer in disgust. He was done. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking in the cold air. "To Earl Jensen." A murmur went through the crowd. Earl felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He didn't look at anyone. He walked to the clerk's table, his legs feeling unsteady, and wrote out the check that would take nearly every dollar he had saved. Later that afternoon, after the crowds had gone and the last of the equipment had been hauled away, Earl found Roger sitting on the back step of the empty farmhouse. He was just staring out at the barn, his shoulders slumped. The only things left in the yard were the old blacksmithing tools Earl had bought. Earl walked over and sat down beside him. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the mournful cry of the wind around the corners of the house. "Those were my grandfather's," Roger said finally, nodding toward the anvil. "I know," Earl said. "I figured they should stay with the farm." Roger finally turned to look at him, his eyes red-rimmed. "Why, Earl? Why did you buy the homestead? You paid too much for it." "Because it's a good farm," Earl said simply, "and it ought to be farmed by a Peterson." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a simple, hand-written lease agreement. "I'll rent it to you, Roger. You can live in the house. You can work the 80. The rent will be a third of the crop, paid after harvest, just like in the old days. No cash up front." Roger stared at the paper, then at Earl, his mouth opening and closing. He couldn't speak. He was a proud man, and he had been broken. Now, the man he had ridiculed for years was offering him a lifeline, a chance to reclaim not his empire, but his dignity. I don't understand," Roger stammered. "You were wrong about the money, Roger," Earl said, his voice gentle but firm. "You thought debt was a tool. It's not. It's a master, and it's a cruel one. But you were never wrong about the work. You're a good farmer. One of the best I know. This land deserves a good farmer." He stood up. "I'll leave you to think on it." He walked away, leaving Roger on the steps, holding the piece of paper that represented a second chance, one far more valuable than the old tractor Earl had named. The farm crisis of the 1980s changed the landscape of the heartland forever. More than a third of the farms in Blackwood County went under. White crosses appeared in the courthouse square, one for each farm lost. But out on the Jensen place, life found its rhythm again. Roger Peterson accepted Earl's offer. He moved his family back into the old farmhouse. He farmed the 80 acres with borrowed equipment, mostly from Earl. The two men, once rivals separated by a gulf of philosophy, now worked side by side. Roger learned from Earl how to rebuild a carburetor, how to get by without spending a fortune at the dealership. Earl learned from Roger about new hybrid seeds and more efficient crop rotation. They became friends. The community's view of Earl Jensen underwent a quiet, profound transformation. The laughter and whispers at the co-op were replaced by a deep, abiding respect. Men who had once mocked his old red tractors now came to him, hat in hand, asking if he could help them fix their own aging equipment to keep it running one more season. Tom Thompson, Jr., who had taken over the John Deere dealership after his father retired, stopped by one day. He found Earl in the workshop, his hands covered in grease. "Earl," he said, looking around at the tidy shop. "I was a punk kid back then. We all were. We thought we had the world by the tail." He shook his head. "My dad and we financed a lot of those guys right into bankruptcy. I see their faces in my sleep." He looked at Earl. "You were the only one who saw it coming. You were the only one who was smart enough to stay out." "I wasn't smart, Tom," Earl replied, wiping a wrench clean. "I was just scared of owing anybody anything. My dad taught me that." By the early 1990s, things had stabilized. The rains returned, and prices slowly recovered. Roger had saved enough money to buy back the 80 acres from Earl for what he'd paid for it, with no interest. He was a different man, humbled, wiser, and fiercely allergic to debt. He farmed his 80 acres and was content. One warm autumn afternoon, years later, Earl was in the workshop. He was older now, his hair grey, his movements a little slower, but his hands were as steady as ever. He was bent over the engine of Old Reliable, showing his 12-year-old grandson, Daniel, how to set the valve lash with a feeler gauge. "You feel that?" Earl said, guiding the boy's small hand. "Just a little bit of drag. Not too tight, not too loose. That's the spot." The boy was fascinated. "Grandpa, why do we still use these old tractors? My friend's dad has a new one with a computer in it." Earl smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He pointed to the tractor. "That engine there, Danny, is 70 years old. It has 5 moving parts in its ignition system: points, condenser, coil, rotor, and cap. I can fix any one of them on the side of a field with a screwdriver and a file. That new tractor with the computer has 1,000 parts in its ignition, and they're all inside a little black box. When it breaks, you can't fix it. You just have to replace it. And you have to pay whatever the company wants to charge you for that little black box." He put his arm around his grandson's shoulder and looked at the 2 Farmalls, standing side by side, their red paint glowing in the afternoon sun. They weren't just machines. They were a philosophy. They were a statement. They were proof that sometimes the oldest, simplest way is the strongest. "We use these tractors," Earl said softly, "because we don't work for them. They work for us. They don't own us. We own them. And there's not a banker in the world who can take them away. Never forget that." The boy nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Outside, the wind rustled the dry leaves of the corn in the fields, a sound like a gentle applause. Earl handed the wrench to his grandson, and together they went back to work, the quiet legacy of the farm passing from one generation to the next.